The train doors slammed open under a sky the color of iron. A gust of freezing air tore through the platform, carrying with it the sound of rattling chains and tired footsteps. From the dim interior of the boxcars stepped Hungarian prisoners of war, thin, unshaven, eyes dulled by exhaustion and disbelief. Their journey had been long, crossing half of Europe and the wide Atlantic before being swallowed by the vast plains of the American Midwest. Now, in the dying light of a winter dusk, they stood face to face with their new reality, Camp Stockton, a sprawling prisoner compound deep in the heartland. Guards barked orders in English, their words sharp and clipped, the meaning clear enough. The Hungarians shuffled into line, boots scuffing against the frost-bitten ground. Every step echoed a mix of humiliation and stubborn pride. They had once served under banners of empire, marched with confidence through the Carpathians, and believed themselves heirs to centuries of resilience. But now, under foreign skies, they were the conquered. Inside the barracks, dim lanterns flickered over rows of wooden bunks. On each lay a neatly folded item, thin, pale blankets stamped USARMYQUARTERMASTER. The men stopped in disbelief. Some stared, others chuckled. A few laughed outright, the sound brittle and mocking. "Is this what they call a blanket?" One soldier sneered, holding it up to the light. The cloth shimmered faintly, light as paper. "In Hungary, even our recruits sleep under wool thick enough to break your back." Laughter rolled through the room, louder now, spreading like a fever. A captain named Laszlo Benedek shook his head with a smirk. Americans, always so proud, yet this is what they give their prisoners: a handkerchief. Around him, men slapped the blankets against their legs, tossing jokes about American luxury. It was a small rebellion, a way to reclaim dignity through mockery. But the guards said nothing. They'd seen this before, disbelief turning to laughter, laughter to silence. Outside, a wind was rising, low and restless, pushing across the plains. As the men settled in for the night, one of them, young, sharp-faced Istvan Kerekes, muttered, "If this is all that stands between us and winter, we'll be frozen by dawn." No one disagreed. They wrapped themselves half-heartedly, still grinning, still sure that these strange, weightless covers were a joke. Yet, as the lanterns dimmed and the cold crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, a different truth began to unfold. One that would test not only their bodies, but the very foundation of their pride. The first hour of night passed with jokes and murmurs. The Hungarians, still clinging to bravado, compared their new quarters to the barracks they had left behind in Szeged and Debrecen. Their laughter filled the stale air, trying to mask an unease they refused to admit. Captain Laszlo Benedek leaned against a post, arms crossed. "Do you remember the winter of '41? He asked, voice tinged with nostalgia. "We marched through the Eastern Front in snow waist-deep, and our blankets were thick as carpets." Sergeant Farkas, older and broad-shouldered, nodded with pride. "Real wool, none of this factory nonsense. These American sheets wouldn't keep a cat warm." The others chuckled, nodding as if agreement could stave off the cold beginning to seep into their bones. Beyond the barracks walls, the wind had turned vicious. It howled through the cracks, rattling loose boards and pushing smoke from the small iron stove back into the room. The temperature was dropping faster than any of them expected. One by one, the voices faded. The laughter died. They began to feel it, the creeping bite of the prairie winter, sharp and dry, the kind of cold that doesn't simply touch skin, but hunts for it, sliding under collars, crawling between ribs. Private Janos Kovac pulled his blanket tighter, shivering. "It's thinner than air," he muttered, teeth chattering. Across the room, Istvan Kerekes shifted restlessly. His fingers, stiff with cold, brushed the fabric again. It felt strange, soft but dense, smoother than any wool he had known. For a moment he thought it almost retained heat, but pride made him dismiss the thought. Outside, the guards carried on their rounds, indifferent. To them, this was routine. Another convoy, another camp, another night under the same endless wind. They had their coats, gloves, and coffee. The prisoners had their pride and their thin blankets. By midnight, even pride was beginning to crack. The barracks had gone quiet. Only the wind spoke, hissing through the slats like an unseen presence. A man coughed. Another cursed under his breath. The warmth from the stove had faded, swallowed by the cold pressing against the wooden walls. Captain Benedek, who had mocked the loudest, now sat upright, eyes open in the darkness. His breath fogged the air in small clouds. He pressed his hand beneath the blanket and felt, unexpectedly, a pocket of warmth. It shouldn't have been possible. The cloth was too light, too thin. Yet somehow it trapped the heat radiating from his own body. He said nothing, not yet. Admitting that would mean surrendering more than comfort. It would mean acknowledging that perhaps, in this foreign land, the Americans had outsmarted them. The wind struck the barracks again, shaking the walls. A few men stirred, groaning softly. Pride, for the moment, was losing its battle against reality. The night was far from over. By the time the camp clock struck 2, the barracks had transformed into a frozen tomb. The air had hardened, every breath visible in the faint lamplight like smoke rising from exhausted lungs. The wind outside screamed like a living thing, clawing at the walls, forcing its way through every crack and seam. The men had stopped speaking. There was nothing left to say. Even the proudest among them now fought to control their shivering. Every movement sounded like wood splintering. Sergeant Farkas lay curled on his bunk, whispering prayers he hadn't said since his mother's death. "If this keeps up till dawn," he murmured to no one, "half of us won't wake." Captain Benedek heard him and clenched his jaw. He refused to believe that death could come from something as simple as American cloth. Yet when he reached for his water tin, he found it already frozen solid. His breath caught. This wasn't mere discomfort. This was danger. Across the aisle, young Istvan Kerekes stirred again. He had wrapped himself completely, cocooned in the thin blanket he once mocked. At first, it had felt useless, but now, it was different. Beneath it, his body heat stayed trapped, the warmth gathering instead of escaping. It didn't make sense, but he felt it, a barrier invisible but real. He sat up slightly, glancing around. Other men were shivering uncontrollably, their pride now stripped bare by the night. Quietly, he pulled his blanket higher, tucking its edges beneath his feet and neck. Within minutes, the shivering slowed. His pulse steadied. He felt alive again. The same realization began spreading silently through the room. Men who had mocked the American blankets now clutched them desperately, tucking, folding, pressing them close as though afraid the heat would vanish if they breathed too loud. A low groan came from the far corner. Private Janos Kovac whispered, "My fingers. I can't feel them." 2 others crawled toward him, dragging their blankets. Without words, they pressed close, sharing warmth, a fragile human instinct that refused to die even behind barbed wire. Within minutes, the trembling eased. Captain Benedek finally gave in. He wrapped himself fully, pulling the cloth over his shoulders and beneath his boots. He didn't understand it, how such a flimsy weave could shield them from this brutal cold, but he didn't need to. He only knew it worked. When dawn finally crawled across the horizon, the world outside was white. Frost coated the ground like ash, and icicles hung from the barrack roof like glass daggers. But inside, the prisoners stirred, weak but alive. Not one had frozen, not one had died. And in the dim silence that followed, disbelief replaced pride. The very blankets they had mocked had saved them. Morning came slowly, as if reluctant to touch the frozen camp. A pale sun hung over the horizon, offering light but no warmth. Frost rimed the windows, turning the world beyond into a blur of white and steel. Inside, the men stirred in heavy silence, rising from their bunks like ghosts. Their breath still fogged the air, but there was life in it, life that, by all rights, should have been gone. Captain Benedek rubbed his hands together, his joints stiff. His eyes fell on the blanket that had covered him through the night. It looked ordinary, dull grey, frayed at the edges, but the thought of how it had kept him alive stirred something he couldn't quite name. Around him, the others were doing the same. Men who had mocked the cloth now studied it with suspicion and awe. One soldier stretched it between his fingers, holding it up to the window. "It's thin," he murmured, "but it's warm." Sergeant Farkas grunted. "Warm enough to save us," he said, his voice hoarse. He looked at Benedek, the old pride flickering but dim. "Seems we owe these Americans a strange kind of thanks." No one answered. Gratitude was a hard word in their mouths. They had been taught that strength was weight, that real men endured under the burden of heavy wool, iron discipline, and hard tradition. But here, in this foreign land, lightness had proven stronger than weight. As the guards entered for roll call, their boots crunching on frost, the prisoners fell into line. The guards said little, just a count, a nod, a brief glance. They seemed unbothered by the cold, wrapped in layers of thick coats. When the Americans left, whispers spread through the ranks. "What kind of fabric is this?" asked one man. "It isn't wool." "They make it from something else," said another, his tone uncertain. "A factory blend, maybe." Synthetic Istvan Kerekes, younger and sharper than most, frowned. Then they found a way to make warmth out of nothing. The idea unsettled them more than they admitted. To them, warmth was earned, through hardship, through struggle, through endurance. But these blankets, light and mass-produced, broke every rule they believed in. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the frost began to melt. Steam rose faintly from the barracks' roofs. The men sat outside on crude benches, blankets draped around their shoulders. Not one of them laughed now. Captain Benedek stared at the horizon and said quietly, "If they give these to prisoners, imagine what they give their soldiers." No one replied. They didn't need to. The thought hung in the air, heavier than any blanket could be. By midday, the camp had thawed just enough for movement. Guards hauled crates across the yard, while a few prisoners were assigned to sweep frost from the walkways. The sun shimmered off the icy ground, giving the illusion of warmth that none of them could feel. It was during one of these chores that Istvan Kerekes overheard two American soldiers speaking near the supply shed. Their accents were thick, their tone casual, but the words struck him like a blow. "New shipment of blankets from Massachusetts just came in," one guard said, tossing a cigarette butt into the snow. $250,000 a month, they said. "Can you believe that?" His partner laughed. "You could wrap every prisoner in Texas twice and still have enough left for the next camp." Kerekes froze mid-step. The number was staggering, $250,000 a month. He repeated it under his breath, barely believing it. When the guards left, he hurried to share what he'd heard. By the evening, the barracks hummed with whispers. Men who had once sneered now spoke with a kind of reverent disbelief. 250,000, muttered Sergeant Farkas, shaking his head. We could barely produce 10,000 in Budapest during peacetime, and they're giving them to prisoners. Benedek's face was unreadable. That's not production, he said slowly. That's power. He held the blanket between his hands, running his thumb along the weave. This isn't wool. It's something new. Lighter, cheaper, but stronger. They've built a war machine that doesn't run on pride. It runs on efficiency. The others listened in silence. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about the cold. It was about capacity, about what kind of nation could produce warmth as easily as bullets. That night, the guards confirmed what Kerekes had overheard. Captain Miller, the American officer overseeing supply distribution, spoke briefly with one of the translators. His words spread through the camp within hours. The blankets, he said, aren't wool at all. They're made from rayon and synthetic fibers, a blend designed in US factories to insulate better than natural materials. We can make millions of them a year, millions. The number lingered in every mind like a storm cloud. Benedek sat on his bunk long after lights out, staring at the folded blanket on his knees. He had spent a lifetime believing that craftsmanship and heritage made a nation strong. The weight of tradition, the texture of real wool, the pride of handmade goods. But here was proof that speed, scale, and innovation had rewritten those rules. The cold had tested their endurance. The blanket had tested their beliefs. For the first time since captivity, Benedek felt something he had not felt even on the battlefield: doubt. The second night came even colder than the first. The wind screamed against the barracks like something alive, furious and unrelenting. But this time, no one laughed. No one mocked the thin American blankets or the factory-made fabric. The prisoners filed into their bunks quietly, each man clutching the same cloth he had scorned only 48 hours before. Captain Benedek lay still, staring up at the ceiling beams, trembling under the storm's weight. Every creak sounded like a whisper of judgment. Across from him, Istvan Kerekes was already wrapped tightly, his breath shallow but calm. Around them, the rhythmic sound of shivering bodies had been replaced by silence, a heavy, thoughtful kind of quiet. Hours passed. Outside, frost crept across the window glass like ghostly veins. Inside, the men who had once laughed now whispered prayers, some for warmth, some for understanding. Without these, Kerekes murmured into the dark, his voice barely audible, half of us would be dead already. Benedek turned toward him. For a moment neither spoke. Then, in a low voice, Benedek replied, "You're right." His tone carried no pride, no sarcasm, just the blunt truth of a man who had seen his arrogance stripped away by necessity. In the corner, Sergeant Farkas stirred. "Say that again," he said softly, disbelief thick in his throat. "I said he's right," Benedek repeated, louder this time. "We mocked what saved us." The words hung there, sharp as glass, until even the wind seemed to pause. Around them, faces turned toward the captain, the man who had led their derision, now confessing what none had dared to admit. "It's a strange thing," Benedek continued. "We thought strength came from weight, that the heavier the blanket, the truer the soldier. But tonight, I see it differently. Perhaps the strongest things aren't heavy at all." No one argued. Pride had no footing left. When dawn came, it revealed a camp draped in silence. The sun rose pale and distant, glinting off the frost that clung to the wire fences. The guards moved about their rounds as usual, but something invisible had shifted in the air. The Hungarians no longer carried themselves with disdain. Their movements were slower, quieter, as though they were uncertain of what to do with their newfound humility. Later that morning, Sergeant Farkas found Benedek outside, standing near the fence, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "You think they meant to teach us a lesson?" Farkas asked. Benedek shook his head. "No, I think they just didn't care whether we learned it or not." That thought unsettled Farkas more than anything. Mercy without motive, compassion given without expectation, was something they had never seen in war. For the first time, the men began to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as something more complicated, not kind, not cruel, simply human. That afternoon, the wind died down, leaving the camp in brittle stillness. The snow glittered beneath a pale sun, untouched except for the footprints of guards making their rounds. Inside the barracks, the men moved slower, their laughter gone, but their tempers cooled. For the first time since arriving, no one argued over rations or space. They sat quietly, wrapped in their blankets, each lost in thought. From the guard tower, Sergeant Daniels watched them with a cup of steaming coffee in hand. He had seen German, Italian, and even Japanese prisoners pass through camps across the states, but these Hungarians were different, prouder, louder, more wounded by captivity itself. Now, watching their subdued faces through the glass, he saw something else, a quiet understanding. Near the entrance of Barrack 4, a young prisoner was coughing violently, his thin body shaking with each breath. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered Texan named Miller, hesitated for a moment, then walked over. He didn't speak. He just pulled an extra blanket from the supply cart and draped it over the man's shoulders. The gesture was small, almost routine, but it froze the room. Every Hungarian who saw it fell silent. There was no arrogance in Miller's face, no pity either, just a plain, wordless act of decency. He nodded once to the prisoner, turned, and went back to his post. Istvan Kerikes stared after him, the steam from his breath clouding the air. "He didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "No," Benedek replied. "He didn't." Later that day, a wagon rolled through the main gate carrying quilts and donated bedding from nearby American towns. Some were floral, some patched from family fabrics, their bright colors jarring against the drab uniforms of war. The guards distributed them evenly among the barracks, saying little. When one of the quilts, a child's patchwork stitched with crooked hearts, was laid over an older lieutenant named Horvath, the man touched the embroidery with trembling fingers. "A child made this," he whispered, "for us." That night, as lanterns dimmed, the barracks hummed with low voices. Some prisoners argued that it was propaganda, a psychological trick meant to soften them. But others, more honest, stayed silent, staring at their blankets as if they weighed more than iron. Major Benedek sat at the end of his bunk, the floral quilt folded across his knees. "They could have let us freeze," he said softly, almost to himself. "Instead, they saved us." No one replied. The truth was too strange to touch. For men who had been raised to see compassion as weakness, this quiet mercy cut deeper than any insult. Outside, the night was calm for the first time in days. The wind had moved on, leaving only the faint sound of boots crunching over snow, and, somewhere far away, the whistle of a passing freight train. Inside the barracks, men who had once seen their captors as monsters now lay awake, wondering what kind of enemy offered warmth instead of wrath. The following days passed under skies as pale as ash. The cold lingered, but it no longer ruled them. The thin American blankets, once objects of ridicule, had become lifelines, trusted like old friends. The men handled them carefully now, folding them each morning with reverence, as if afraid they might be taken away. A strange calm had settled over Camp Stockton. The guards noticed it too. The prisoners no longer mocked or shouted, no longer demanded extra rations or muttered curses in their language when orders were given. Something inside them had changed, quietly and permanently. Captain Benedek felt it most of all. He carried the weight of that realization everywhere he went. The man who had once sneered at American softness now found himself searching the faces of the guards with uneasy curiosity. These men, his captors, moved with a kind of effortless confidence. Not prideful, not cruel, simply certain. It was the certainty of abundance, of a nation that could afford mercy because it had nothing to fear. One morning, as Benedek stood outside near the fence, Sergeant Daniels approached him. The American's breath misted in the air. "You survived the worst of it," he said casually, nodding toward the horizon. "Cold fronts breaking soon." Benedek hesitated, unsure whether to answer. "It was colder than we expected." Daniels gave a faint grin. "You're not the first to think those blankets were a joke." He sipped from his coffee mug, eyes distant. "Truth is, they're made for soldiers who move, light, fast, efficient. Can't carry the world on your back anymore." Benedek nodded slowly, understanding the meaning beneath the words. The old ways, the belief that heaviness meant strength, belonged to another age. Later that afternoon, a rumor spread that the war in Europe was shifting, that Germany's hold was weakening. The news reached the Hungarians like a chill wind, sharper than the Texas winter. For the first time, they began to imagine returning home, not to glory, but to ruble. In the barracks that night, Istvan Kerekes spoke quietly. "Do you think we'll ever forget this?" Benedek looked at the flickering lantern, his face etched with fatigue. "No," he said, "and we shouldn't." Silence followed. Around them, men pulled their blankets tighter, not from cold, but from memory. The fabric had become a symbol of something larger than survival. It was proof that the world they'd believed in, one built on might and pride, was crumbling, replaced by a different kind of power, the power of innovation, of compassion, of scale. Outside, frost glimmered faintly under moonlight. Inside, the prisoners slept not as soldiers of a fallen empire, but as men who had glimpsed humanity in their enemy, and could no longer hate as easily as before. By the spring of 1945, the frost had lifted from the Texas plains. The camp's fences, once rimed with ice, now shimmered with rainwater. Birds returned to the barren trees, and the days grew longer, but for the prisoners, time had slowed into a strange limbo between captivity and freedom. Rumors drifted through the camp like dust on the wind. Whispers of surrender, of cities bombed into silence, of armies disintegrating on distant fronts. When the news finally came that Germany had fallen, the Hungarians stood motionless. Some cheered, others wept. Most simply stared into the open sky, unable to feel the victory or defeat, only the hollow weight of both. Repatriation began within weeks. Men were called by name, lined up, processed, and told they would soon return to Europe. Each was permitted to carry only what could fit into a single sack: a uniform, a letter, a photograph, and one blanket. The choice surprised no one. Every man clung to the same thin American cloth that had saved him. Some folded it neatly, others draped it across their shoulders as they waited by the train yard. Istvan Kerekes watched the guards one last time. Sergeant Miller, the same man who had once placed an extra blanket over a coughing prisoner, passed by without a word. Their eyes met for only a second, a fleeting exchange between two men who understood more than they could say. "Thank you," Carecus whispered, though he doubted Miller heard it. Captain Benedek stood near the gate, his blanket folded under his arm. The fabric was worn now, frayed at the corners, faintly smelling of smoke and dust. Yet to him it carried a weight no wool ever had. It was proof, not just of survival, but of transformation. As the train doors clanged open, Benedek turned to his men. "Keep them," he said, "not because they're warm, but because they remind us of what we didn't understand." The soldiers nodded, their expressions solemn. When the train pulled away, the camp shrank in the distance, the watchtowers, the fences, the barracks that had once felt like a prison. And yet, in that moment, it also felt like the place where something inside them had been set free. Months later, in a small apartment in Budapest, Benedek unfolded his blanket on a wooden chair. The war was over, but its ghosts lingered in every cracked wall and empty street. He ran his hand over the fabric slowly, remembering the Texas wind, the laughter, the cold, the silence. "It saved us," he whispered to himself. Then, after a pause, "and it changed us." Outside, church bells rang for peace, but inside that quiet room, the sound was more personal. The echo of humility learned the hard way. Years passed. The war faded into textbooks, into ceremonies, into the quiet retellings of old men who once carried rifles. Yet for the Hungarian prisoners who had endured the winter at Camp Stockton, one memory refused to fade: the night the thin American blankets had saved their lives. In the years after his return, Captain Laszlo Benedek rarely spoke of captivity. He rebuilt what he could of his life, taught at a small academy, and raised 2 children who grew up never knowing the weight of war. But in the corner of his wardrobe, folded with care, remained that same grey blanket. Sometimes, when the nights turned cold, he would take it out, unfold it gently, and let his fingers trace its frayed edges. His wife once asked him why he kept it. "Because," he said quietly, "it reminds me that strength doesn't always shout." Other former prisoners told similar stories. Some had hidden their blankets in trunks, ashamed to admit that their survival had come from the kindness and ingenuity of their former enemy. Others kept them in plain sight, draped over chairs or beds, not as trophies, but as reminders of humility. One man, Istvan Kerekes, years later wrote in his diary, "I thought pride would keep me warm. It didn't. What saved me was a piece of cloth I had mocked, and the hands of those I thought I hated." His grandchildren found those words decades after his death, beside the folded blanket that had followed him through life like a quiet companion. For historians, the story of those blankets was a footnote, a detail buried under greater tales of strategy and politics. But for the men who had lived it, it was the truest lesson of the war. They had learned that compassion could survive even behind barbed wire, that innovation could be gentler than iron, and that the enemy's mercy could sometimes feel more powerful than victory. When Benedek grew old, he donated the blanket to a small museum in Szeged. The curator asked him for a story to accompany it, but he offered only a few words, written in a careful, trembling hand. "Mocked at dusk, worshipped by dawn, proof that even in war, warmth can come from the unlikeliest hands." Years later, school children would stop before that display, reading the label beside the glass. Few would understand the depth of it, how pride and humility, contempt and gratitude could all be woven into a single thread of fabric. But to those who knew, it said everything. And maybe that's the part of history that matters most, not the thunder of artillery or the banners of conquest, but the quiet strength of something soft. A blanket, a gesture, a choice, proof that even in the darkest winter, humanity still burns bright. If stories like this remind you that compassion can outlast conflict, help us keep these forgotten moments alive. Like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. And tell us, if you were in that barracks, would you have laughed at those blankets or held on to them for dear life?